And that makes it a pretty tough leadership challenge, doesn't it? This is something that can't be handed out to some guy in the procurement function or some guy in the finance function or some guy, I'm using guy in the non-sexist term I have, somebody in even a sort of specialist role. We're talking about breaking down silos, and that requires leadership from the top, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, Richard. And I think and I think I've touched on this before, it does require real leadership at the top, but it also requires a different mentality. It does require breaking away from sort of this functional silo mentality that we've had before. And I think certainly from my perspective, from a finance perspective, I see there's a big opportunity here for the finance function to work across the business to drive some of these synergies and benefits. But you're absolutely right. It is about it's about a cultural change. I don't think it's something that can happen overnight. There are huge change management implications from going down this journey, but I think it's something that has to happen.
Yeah, I mean, cultural change is quite a nebulous subject. Guy, are there ways that we can talk about this, perhaps in a more defined way? It feels like this is really an issue about good risk management as much as anything else, in terms of ability to flex and ability to cope with downturn.
You're right to say that there are risk aspects. You're right to say that there are many different facets which connect to. You can make it a balance sheet issue, for example, if you think about investment. You can make it an operational or speed issue. What connects all of these is it's a different narrative, and it's a different internal story within the organization that leads to what is it that we think the role of procurement is, and what are the expectations we have from our suppliers, the role that our suppliers can play in our business. And that education piece is probably one of the biggest single cultural things that one's got to do across the business. So the chief exec is thinking differently about how he engages with that commercial market of suppliers around him to achieve his own objectives, rather than just initially having a gut instinct that, oh, he's got to approach one of his colleagues to do it. And likewise, then the tier in the board, the tier below the board, I would encourage them all to start asking a similar set of questions along those, possibly we'll elaborate on later, but along those lines in terms, because that's where the cultural impact ultimately has to lie. Now, I think the opportunity for procurement, it has to lead the charge in terms of being the educator, set expectations in the business, because I think often when you ask the board what do they want from procurement, they'll usually say a bit more of the same, just faster and better, please. Whereas the conversation we're starting to have now is saying faster and better isn't enough. Actually, there are some profoundly different things that need to be discussed and that have an impact on the bearing and the direction of your business, which come from how do you mobilize your suppliers.
It's interesting because it feels like a conversation that was had with the finance function 20 or 30 years ago, where it was a question of saying, well, finance is really, if finance is just adding up the numbers and it's doing something wrong, it has to be connected and reflect the business much more broadly and its strategic aims.
Absolutely, Richard. And I think, to be honest, let's not kid ourselves that challenge for finance has been solved, because it hasn't. And this goes right to the heart of the problem here, because what we're talking about, what Guy's been talking about, is how do we make the business construct work more effectively together. And for me, from a finance perspective, it's really about sort of truly embedding finance people in the procurement arm of the business to work together with our procurement colleagues to really understand how we can drive the sorts of synergies and efficiencies that we've.
And I think that Rich talked earlier about silos, and one of the interesting things about procurement and finance is there are two of the functions in a business whose remit arches across the whole business, and they actually break down silos. I've had an argument that a couple of chief execs quite like procurement projects because it's one of the few things which allow where they can make a change management program that extends across the whole business, as opposed to segments of the business. And it actually then becomes exciting at the chief exec level to be engaging in these types of discussions in terms of their own personal objectives for having an impact on their own business.
Those messages are very important inside the business, clearly, and I think this idea of taking a holistic view is pretty compelling, given the fact that people are looking much more holistically at their supply chains and customer relationships.